Greetings, and I'd like to welcome you back to the 5-day video course, Legacy of Trauma, the African American Experience. And today we are on day 4. We're going to be talking about historical trauma and how Black folks have gotten to this position where they are today. Our condition did not just start today. Our condition, the things that we see did not just start 20 years ago, 30 years ago. These things, we've been in this motion to where we're at for almost 400 years. And when you don't take the historical perspective on how a group of people have gotten to where they are, you really miss a lot of things. So in today's course, what we're going to do is touch on 5 of the 6 what I call trauma points that African American folks have experienced to get to where we are today. And then in day 5 is when we're going to touch on the 6th one. So stay tuned. You're going to enjoy this course. Definitely get something to take some notes on, and there's gonna be some good information shared. But you do know that this is a whole full day training just in one day. So there's gonna be some things that we're not gonna cover today that will be covered in its own home study course later on. So do know that you are gonna get a microwave version of what has happened in the African American community in today's course, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to get some quality information that is going to make you think, it's going to make you process, and hopefully it's going to help you in your healing journey, because sometimes we get information that we thought we knew, but we really didn't know 100%, and we connect dots to where we are today, where we've been, and where we will go. So enjoy. All right, here we are, day 4, historical trauma. Historical trauma. Some of you may have never heard of this term before. It is a very popular term in the human service world, if you think about professions. And also, I would also say in the world of psychology as well. And we're going to talk about what historical trauma is in the context of African American folks. Now, Black folks have been in this world from the beginning of what we know as humans being in this world. But the historical trauma that Black people in America have experienced, Black people who are descendants of slaves have experienced, is significant, and it's different than other forms of experiences of slavery that other people have had. Now, I do know that what we have now as African American folks were originally, and many people even still believe, are African folks. But one thing that we have to be honest about is the cultural differences between what we now know as Africans and what we now know as African American folks. There is a cultural difference, and there's a reason for that and how we got here. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's course. When I think of historical trauma, I think of a man that I respect highly. His name is Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati. He's a historian and professor locally in my area of the Twin Cities of Minnesota. He's done work all around the nation. He's also known internationally as well for his history. And what he does is history on people who are classified as Black, people who are African American folks, people who have slavery in their lineage. We are descendants of slaves. And that's what Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati has dedicated his life to doing. Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati is an elder, and he's been doing this work for longer than I've been alive. And I held a lot of respect. And I remember being present at one of his talks that he had, I think it was in about 2012, 2013. And he just casually said this line, which, is always a testament to someone who has great knowledge, where they just say these things that are profound and they just kind of say them casually, like it doesn't even mean anything to him. And he just said, history is not about the past, it's about the present. And that stuck with me, and I wrote it down, and I just thought about it. And, I keep this notion in my head, because how I interpret this quote is what Dr. Mahmoud El-Kati was conveying was that we may think of history as this thing that happened that's not connected, but all these things are connected. We are connecting dots from our past to our present, and I'll even extend and say even to our future, that we don't even realize most of the time. And this is where we're at. And this is the essence of the historical trauma, if you ask me, is what we see today did not just happen today. What we see today with Black folks isn't something that just sprung up a year or two ago. This is hundreds of years of getting to this point. 400 plus years of getting to this point where we're at today. And we know that we're not in the best position, but it is important to understand the foundation and understand the connection on how we actually got here. So history is not about the past, it's about the present. What is historical trauma? Right? Historical trauma is an example of intergenerational trauma. It's caused by events that target a group of people. Thus, even family members who have not directly experienced the trauma can feel the effects of the event generations later. Again, it's an example of intergenerational trauma, which we're going to break down that term in a moment. But the effects can be felt generations later. You know, it's something that we call social learning theory. You have a group of people who are going through a horrific event, getting their lives shaken up, changing their names, their religions, forcing them to merge with other groups, first forcing them to sexually engage with people that they don't know and to reproduce. And what this all does, forcing them to eat a diet that they've never ate before, forcing them to grow things and to work, crazy amount of hours to the point of almost death. Think about the levels of dehydration, the levels of just physical toll on the body every day, working in hot conditions, right? And sometimes even cold conditions. Think places like Virginia, places like, even though we get over the Mason-Dixon line, we still have slavery and people who were slaves all over. So all different types of weather conditions. But the way that people adapted to live during that time has transitioned on generation to generation and has manifested and morphed to meet the needs of the environments that they've been in. This concept was brought forth by Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who was a Native woman. And she brought the concept of historical trauma in the 80s when she was working on her dissertation. And what she was trying to figure out is, why have Native Americans not achieved the quote unquote American dream? And she knew the answer to this, but she wanted to make it a scholarly discussion. She wanted to make it a scholarly way of understanding why and how how Native Americans have got to the point that they've gotten to. Now, in our community with Black folks, we've had different conversations about this. Some of our great scholars have talked about this. Dr. Naim Akbar, Dr. Bobby E. Wright, even folks like Dr. Patricia Newton, Dr. Francis Chris Welsing, even to a certain extent, Dr. Amos Wilson, even to, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. We've had folks who've talked about this in different ways, but they not necessarily use the term historical trauma per se. But the person who really brought this concept forward is Dr. Joy DeGruy. And we're going to talk about Dr. Joy DeGruy in a moment. She's the one who really had pushed this work even forward and into more of a mainstream conversation with her seminal book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. First, what is intergenerational trauma, right? This is a big word, big term, probably new to many of you, but it's something that we definitely need to understand 100%, because intergenerational trauma is exactly the reason why we got to the place that we have gotten to at this very moment. And it is the transmission of historical oppression, toxic stress, and its negative consequences across generations. This is evidence of the impact of the intergenerational trauma on the health / well-being and the health and or social disparities facing a collective group of people or collective of people. So historical trauma is where the event happens. It affects a group of people. Those people adjust, formulate their lives, formulate culture around the event to survive. They teach their kids how to survive. Their kids learn a certain way as they move through the world, and they teach their kids the same thing or similar things to survive. They teach their kids to the next generation, and they teach their kids to the next generation, all in this place of survival, all moving forward, trying to survive in these environments that are anti-Black, very hostile. You have minimal political control, educational control, financial control, defense control, right? You are cultivating a culture around different religions, different foods, different environments, different people. And we're doing all these things in a survival mode mentality. And that's what is intergenerational trauma. One generation transmits the trauma from the next, onto the next, onto the next. And at the same time, as this trauma is being transmitted from one generation to another, there's other things happening around those generations and those environments that they're adjusting to, and then they're teaching their children how to adjust around the trauma. They're teaching their children how to survive and be in survival mode around the trauma. So it's literally a social learning experiment. Social learning theory is taking place where people are just trying to survive in their environments. And unfortunately, when it comes to Black folks, our environments have been pretty hostile and pretty oppressive onto us, and we have continued to figure out a way to make it work as best as we can to survive, which is a testimony to why we're still here. Our historical trauma does not necessarily start with slavery per se. It really starts with the transatlantic slave trade, which a lot of times we don't even talk about. Some people refer to it as the Mahafa 21. But that slave trade was pretty horrific. It involved a lot of the things that we hold near and dear to ourselves today. But the slave trade started on the continent of Africa. You had rival groups fighting at war with each other. We had rival groups trading with Europeans for weapons, for rum as well. So weapons and alcohol, believe it or not, to capture rival groups and sell them off. And, Africans on the continent thought of Europeans as these cannibal people that once they took other Africans away, there was no coming back. And we see, people take trips to Africa to see the slave dungeons before people were sent off. And it's a very emotional experience. I haven't experienced it myself. I do want to at one point, but I do know several people who have, and how it's shifted and changed them just being in that space and feeling that. And you just feel that emotion of, thousands and probably millions of lives just being lost and taken away, never to be seen again on the continent of Africa. So transatlantic slave trade is a huge part to the trauma. It really is the catalyst to what we experience now. And that's just getting them to the boats. We're not even talking about what happens on that voyage, that 3-month or so voyage to this new land, or these new lands, if you want to include South America and the islands in this as well. And, how much death and disease and abuse was taking place on those slave ships where you're shackled literally right next to people, where they're defecating and urinating on you. And you're starving and you barely get any food, and then you're forced to dance at the top of the ship to make sure that you maintain exercise so that you're not passing out once they get you to the new land and sell you off into slavery. So that transatlantic slave trade is very graphic, and we don't think about how that impacts the psyche of people, where you would have people literally jump off of the boats, of the ships, because they rather have just died and commit suicide than actually go to this new land and continue to be tortured and to continue to be sexually abused and raped, continue to be starved. People would just jump off the ship if they could. And I don't think we really think about what that does for the psyche. And we have thousands, millions of Africans who had to endure that actual type of trauma. So that is the catalyst to all this, is the transatlantic slave trade. But I'm going to talk about 6 other points. I'm going to talk about what happened once Africans landed in what we now know as the United States of America. So we're going to talk about the first trauma point, which is chattel slavery. And there's a reason why I use the term chattel slavery, American chattel slavery, because chattel rhymes with cattle, and it's very important to understand why, because African folks were seen as property. African folks were seen as property. From 1619 all the way to 1865, we had what we know as the American chattel slavery system. Now, many people are familiar with the Willie Lynch letters, and there is speculation that those letters are false, but they still tell a huge, if they are false, it's a very metaphorical explanation of what we see. If they're not false papers, then it absolutely talks about the things that happen and how these things happen to get these Africans to become these slaves. And we've seen this for over 200 years of this American chattel slavery. That's a long time. That's several generations just in that time frame. of chattel slavery. You have to remember, folks didn't live that long during these times. We didn't have the healthcare system like we have now. Folks died from all different types of diseases. So, it wasn't very, I don't believe it was very common to have, slaves that lived until they were 80 years old. Like that's a rarity during those conditions and during those times. So there's an important factor to understand here is this is chattel slavery, different than slavery in other parts of the world where you were still able to maintain pieces of your culture. You're still able to maintain pieces of your language. You're still able to maintain your religions. You are still able to maintain your name. Chattel slavery, all that was stripped from people. You weren't even, many a times, you weren't even allowed to even be with people that you actually survived the transatlantic slave trade with. You would get shipped off and sold off to somewhere completely different, which was all strategic. Because when you get beaten down so much and they take everything for you, you have nothing else to give but to submit. So Africans became personal property and slaves, bought and sold as commodities like cattle, like chickens, right? Like pigs, like goats, taken, domesticated, and sold off. It's very horrific stuff. It's not easy to talk about, but this is what happened. Another thing that happened once the importing of Africans was outlawed, and believe it or not, we still had importing Africans after 1808 when that was abolished of actually bringing slaves in on the shores. You always have a black market for things. So there were still African slaves who were being brought over under the table for the black market, quote unquote, right? But really what happened when that importing stopped in 1808, there was a significant thing that happened, what we call breeding farms. Many people aren't familiar with breeding farms. Many people don't know a lot about breeding farms. And I'm going to go in on breeding farms in the actual course that I'm putting together right now that I hope that you definitely come and check out, because we're going to go really in and give great concrete examples of these breeding farms. But it's important to understand in 1808, that's when the import to Africans began. But slavery didn't stop till 1865, right? So you almost had 60 years. You had 57, I don't know, 56 years, 57 years pretty much of this breeding process, this structural, systematic breeding on the continent where we're breeding slaves. It's very interesting when you think of it that way, right? But that's what happened. We had breeding plantations. You had Mandingo slaves that would get paraded from plantation to plantation to impregnate these female slaves to breed these bigger, better, slave children. And you would have women who were actual, they were like Mandinga slaves. They were female breeders, and their jobs were just to have baby after baby after baby. So every 10 months, they're producing a new slave child. Think about what that does to the female body already when you have multiple kids back to back. And imagine being 14, 15, 16 years old, and that's your role, is to continue to produce these slave children as these Mandingo man slaves come, and you're forced to have sex with them. This is the things that Black people had to endure, both Black women at that time, or African women, and Black men. And we talk about sexual abuse now. Think about being a slave, being forced and told, you need to get an erection and you need to penetrate this person. And you need to, impregnate this person. Think about what that does to the female psyche. And then you got to carry that baby and produce that child. And then you're not allowed to really love that child because that's not your role on the plantation. Your role is just to breed it. Think about what that does to the psyche of someone. Think of what that does to the psyche of the male, right? We don't think about the psychology of African slaves. We don't think about the psychology and the things that impacted us as we experience these things, but we should think about it, right? Think about what the typical slave family was like. On the plantation, it was strategic to have Big Mama. That's where we get these concepts from. We have this female matriarch that's in charge, and you destroy the ability of a Black man or an African man to possess what we know as manhood qualities. You destroy that because if you allow that to happen, what do men do? They impose environments. So they would they would force their hand, and they would push, they would revolt if they had any inkling of what they could be as men. And we did have some people, Denmark, Vesey, right? We did have slave revolts that took place, but the overall capacity was to break the man down as much as possible so that they don't organize and realize their ability to combat and to fight against what was actually happening. So that's American chattel slavery. This is a huge trauma point for us because this, the transatlantic slave trade set the mode, but this set the foundation for who and how we ended up the way that we are in the situation that we are in. We're going to talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder because this is what often gets brought up. This is what often gets talked about when we talk about African-American folks, Black folks, the things that we endure, what we see, what we don't see, and just how we have this post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'm going to break down here in a moment. So PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, may develop after a person is exposed to a traumatic event like physical or sexual assault, exposure to disaster or accident, combat, or witnessing a traumatic event. It can last years. The three main symptoms are this. Now think about these three main symptoms. Repeatedly thinking about the trauma, being consistently alert or on guard, avoiding reminders of the trauma. I think that when we look at Black culture and we scale out, pull your lens back. Think about Black culture and think about culturally how we've done these three symptoms as a collective, where we can repeatedly think about the trauma, we were consistently on alert and guard, and we avoid reminders of the trauma, right? And I beg to differ that we don't really have what I call post-traumatic stress disorder. We have more current traumatic stress disorder. Like our trauma is not post. The things that we've experienced isn't just things of the past. It's things that we see today. But that started somewhere. And I would say that it started transatlantic slave trade, kind of revved it up, queued it up, and boom, chattel slavery happens and really pushed it forward as a collective. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that looks at an individual, but if you place the same symptoms, criteria on a group of people, what do you call that? And that is where Dr. Joy DeGruy comes in, where Dr. Joy DeGruy produces post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a condition that exists as the consequences of centuries of chattel slavery, followed by institutionalized racism and oppression, have resulted in multi-generational adaptive behaviors, some positive, reflecting resiliency, and others harmful and destructive. This was brought forth by the lovely Dr. Joy DeGruy as a result of 12 years of quantitative and qualitative research. Seminal work, required reading for every Black home and every Black person. Absolutely, highly suggest that people are familiar with this book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, right here. Dr. Joy DeGruy breaks it down, gives great caveats. If you are not a reader, I highly suggest you at least go to YouTube, type in Dr. Joy DeGruy. She has tons of talks, tons of lectures, and you'll get the emphasis of the book. But but it won't give you the full totality of what's in this book, because this is very important reading, very important understanding as we continue to learn and grow and heal as people. If you want to be the healing, you have to do the work. And this is a part of the work. So we're going to move on to the next trauma point, what we call Jim Crowism. Just like in Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, she talks about after the slavery, there's these institutionalized racism pieces that happen. And one of those institutionalized pieces is what I call Jim Crowism. When we think of Jim Crow, we think of an era, or we think of the stage show, but really it was a system. It was a system that happened for 100 years. 1865, we have the 13th Amendment, and slavery was actually abolished, right? So slavery's over, but we're going to force this involuntary servitude on these slaves, and we're going to punish them and criminalize them for silly things like the pig law. Many people are familiar with the pig law, where if a Black man was accused of stealing a pig from a farmer, a white farmer, they could get put on they would be arrested and convicted and put on a convict lease to work on railroads or work on farms for nothing. And they would put them on these leases for months, right? Years even. And they would just be working and working and working because of the accusation of a pig being stolen. No evidence, just the accusation. So convict leasing shortly came right after slavery. as well as sharecropping. So for the Black folks that we don't criminalize, we're going to keep you working in this feudalistic system, something that we can't forget, which I'm going to go deeper in another course, because economics are tied into all of this. We still need these crops picked. We still need, this is the industry at the time: tobacco, sugar, cotton, rice, right? All these crops. We still need these crops, we planted, pulled, hoed, all this. And the skilled labor were who? The slaves. So we need you to keep working, keep going. So sharecropping, which was slavery, pretty much with a little bit of incentive, which was really nothing. A lot of people got played. A lot of people got screwed over. A lot of people didn't get paid the amount that they were owed for their work. A lot of Black folks were working and leasing out equipment. It was almost like student loan debt. Like, we're going to give you this loan, this equipment, this land. You're going to work it. But guess what? You're never going to catch up. Because I'm going to say, oh, you didn't pay off this, right? Oh, this land is mine now. So a lot of Black folks ended up in bad situations due to this. We also see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So now that we have these free Negroes, we need to figure out who's going to regulate them, because on the slave plantation, we had them regulated. Now you want them to be free, and they're just going to run wild. So let's develop our own militia, vigilante groups, and keep these Negroes under control. Then you see the uptick in lynchings. I have the statistic here. In 1882 to 1964, at least 4,742 lynchings happened in the southern states, and 219 happened in northern states. See, when we think about lynchings, we only think about Mississippi and those tall trees. But lynchings happen not just in southern states and northern states, on the west too. And this number that I have here, which is roughly 5,000, a little under 5,000 lynchings, please believe that is a very low reported number. There was probably way more versions of lynchings that happened that just were not accounted for. Black folks disappeared all the time. Children disappeared all the time. People would be in, Arkansas, and you just see a Black body floating down the river. No one knows who this person is. Oklahoma, you see dead Black bodies in the woods. This was the reality that Black folks had to face and had to deal with. Right here, this photo here. This is a photo from 3 Black men who were lynched in Duluth, Minnesota, June 15th, 1920. 3 Black men. There's a monument up there now that talks about this incident, but these Black men were falsely accused. They were sent to a jail. They were pulled out of jail by an angry mob and lynched. And this is one of the photos from that situation. Can you imagine living in a society where your life can end at any moment for anything? Whether you're right or wrong, boom, it's over. And it's not police doing it. It's just your common, regular old white folks, as you can see in this picture, well dressed, nice hats on, nice overcoats, polished shoes. You have dead Black people. Trauma point number 3, the Great Negro Migration. All right. So during this time, 1915 to 1968, you start to see masses of Black folks leaving the farm and the sharecropping to move to more industry. Again, economics is a huge part of this whole equation, economics. As our industry starts to turn, the Negro now, not the African slave, the Negro has to do something different. Our sharecropping industry is starting to change. We're starting to become more industrial. We're making, we're doing things with lumber. We're doing things with steel. We're building railroads. So the American labor needs to shift. And you start to see Black folks leave the South and move to the West Coast. Black folks leave the South and move up north for these factory jobs and these industries, these manufacturing types of positions, right? So as they started to move, they started to get into issues of segregation in housing and employment, because who else has moved here at this time? European immigrants. So now you have all different type of ethnicities vying and fighting for the same jobs, which is why you see things like unions get formed during this time, which we're also going to talk about in another course. We're going to go deep. And you see things like the Red Summer in 1919, which people just label as racial violence. But why were they fighting? They were fighting over resources, housing, and jobs. The racism was already embedded in that. And please believe, even if I am an Irish person, even if I am a Polish person, doesn't matter. I'm fighting for my survival in this new land. And the way that they treat you Negroes is the same way that I'm going to treat you Negroes, because you Negroes are beneath me. Right? Even though that those folks weren't classified as quote unquote white during this time, they were white enough. That's one thing I don't think we understand, is they were still white enough. Did they have their own version of oppression? Sure. But at the end of the day, the Negro was the bottom rung in the social order. The Negro in this hemisphere, on this land, was the bottom rung. And that's why you've seen strings of violence in Chicago's and the Detroit's and Cleveland, Ohio's, and St. Louis, and all these places where we had these manufacturing plants and things happening. You've seen a lot of this, what they call racial tension. They even call them race riots, right? But really it was fighting over resources that was taking place. So Black folks started to migrate. Someone who talks about this is Isabel Wilkerson. In her book, The Warmth of Other Suns. Great read. If you're a reader, highly suggest that you put this on your list. You can find this book everywhere at your local library. You can get it on Amazon. Isabel Wilkerson. And what Isabel Wilkerson talks about is this great migration. She lays it out. Check out this map. It's a little grainy, but I think you get the point. So the green states are the southern states. These are the highly dense population for Black people. And one of the things that she uncovered in her book is you can almost tell where Black people's lineage is based on where they're at currently. This is amazing. So a lot of folks are from the Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas City, Louisiana, Texas area. A lot of those folks went to the West Coast. And you can even see that influence in places like Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco area, all that, Sacramento. A lot of those Black folks that are in those highly dense Black areas in the Californias, the Arizonas, even in Denver, Colorado, a lot of those folks' lineage comes from like the Texases, Louisianas, Oklahomas, and that area. And then folks who move, Black folks, how they got to Chicago. We know Black folks love talking about how they're from Chicago, especially here in the Twin Cities. A lot of those folks come by way of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. They just went straight up that Mississippi River, right? That's how you get places like the Rock Island, Illinois, Danville, Illinois, the St. Louis, Ohio's. You get folks like Waterloo, Iowa. Racine, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, Ohio, Canton, Dayton, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, Kalamazoo, Michigan. Those Black folks literally migrated straight up for job and opportunity. And that's how we landed in these places. This is how my folks got to the Twin Cities. They came by way of Oklahoma and by way of Tennessee, up to Danville, Illinois. From Danville, Illinois, once the jobs, kind of shrunk and dried up there, they made their way up to the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And that's how I became a fourth generation Minnesotan myself. But this is what happens. And you see this influx of folks who end up on the East Coast, the DCs, the Philadelphias, the New Yorks, the Bostons. Those folks come by way of the Virginias, the North Carolinas, right? The Atlanta, the Georgias, and the Floridas. They just went straight up that East Coast. Right? This is how we end up in these places. Now, in today's time, we have people who travel all over because we have, better transportation access. But that wasn't always like that. We would travel by car for the most part, or train by the most part, to get to these locations, to start a new life, to make new money. A lot of times Black men would leave their families to start the new life and bring some money, get enough money to bring the rest of the family up. So this notion of Black men not being in a family is nothing new. the Black men not being in a family is a historical thing that has happened because Black men have always had to leave for labor reasons, whether that was forced labor reasons because you were sold off in slavery or you were trying to make some money for your family. Connected but disconnected at the same time. And we're going to go deeper in that in another course. So that's the Great Negro Migration. Black folks left the South for economic reasons and also to escape abuse. A lot of Black folks are ran out of places. because they were associated to whistle at a white woman or brushed up or disrespected a white man. And next thing you know, you have a mob at your home in the middle of the night while your family's, rushing to get you out of there for fear of your life being taken away. And that happened with a lot of folks. Trauma point number 4, the urbanization of the Negro, or what we call the ghetto era. All right. So we talk about no man allowed. Yeah, that was something that welfare did not help, but it was nothing that was uncommon for Black men to be not necessarily in the home. Black men have been in the home. This is one of the things that I think that we get lost in the weeds where we talk about Black men are no good and we get to our gender wars, talk about Black men not being at home, and we blame welfare, but there was reasons for it beyond welfare why Black men weren't present. Welfare didn't make it any easier because it literally stated that if you want to receive these benefits, you cannot have a man in your house. And unfortunately, during this time, one thing that we don't talk about a lot is a lot of Black folks were starving during this time. So welfare was something that was not created for us. It was a policy that we got attached to help. Because we had a lot of starvation going on at this time. A lot of Black folks really, really struggling due to Black men going to war, due to Black men leaving for economic opportunities and things just not working out where, something happened to those Black men. The resources did not get back home. A lot of people were left stranded back in their original city. So a lot of things happened, and welfare was one of those answers to try to, assist with the situation. All right. So welfare is something that gets talked about a lot, and unfortunately, we've been racially stereotyped and demeaned for utilizing welfare to things where we get things like welfare queens and all these, just messed up ways of understanding welfare. Even knowing that Black folks are not the number one recipient when we talk about race or ethnicity of welfare, it's white people, it's Caucasians. But we still get this negative label that we're just shiftless and no good, etc. But we'll dive deeper into that momentarily. So one of the things that we see during this era is a decrease in low education, industrial manufacturing jobs. So even though a lot of those Black men left for work, those jobs started to leave the inner city. Our economics changed again. We had another shift. So at that time, you could be a Black man with a 3rd grade education, but if you knew how to work, machinery, and you were good with your hands and you were physical, you could make a living and feed a family. So you didn't need a lot of education to work. And you would see a lot of Black men who would not finish their education and just go work at the local factory when they were 16, 17, 18 years old. Because there was no point. There was no point in thinking about going to college at that time for most Black men, because your trail was straight to the factory. We're gonna talk about that. And then those jobs got transitioned out of the country as we move forward. So as jobs start to leave, so again, we have a exodus of jobs. We have jobs that are starting to slowly go to other places around the world. And, as the adage goes in the Black community, Black folks are last to get hired and first to get fired. And that reigned true during this time as these manufacturing jobs started to ship overseas. We started to lose our employment. The other thing that happened during this time is the constructing of the interstates. Now, this is something we're going to go deeper in another course. But the interstates broke up a lot of Black communities locally. And where I'm from, St. Paul, we had the historical Rondo neighborhood, which was where we had a lot of Black folks. And you got to remember, due to redlining, Black folks were forced to live together. So you have the Black doctor, the Black lawyer, the Black dentist, the Black mechanic, all living in the same neighborhood next to the person who wasn't doing those things. So if a Black person had an issue, they could always go talk to their neighbor and go, knock on, their neighbor's door and say, hey, I'm having some legal issues. I need some help. And they'll get, local advice, free advice on things because they were neighbors. They were connected. It was a community. It was an opportunity. But as the neighborhood started to get more and more impoverished due to not having resources and people losing their jobs, the folks who did have means had an opportunity to leave. Even though, the middle class left, they were also facing different versions of racism in some of these suburban neighborhoods that they were even allowed to move there. But this is what happened. We had our communities started to shred. We literally lost a lot of our connection and our fabric and our genius due to the situation. We also seen not only crime go up due to the lack of jobs, we started to see our families deteriorate as well. And then we also started to see drugs get pumped into the community. So you have jobs leaving the community, drugs coming into the community. And this created a huge dysfunction into what we now know, or what we now call the ghettos. Even though in the ghettos is something we didn't create, it's definitely something that has been put upon us as the folks who carry the name ghetto. And when people use the term ghetto, it's associated directly with us. This is important to understand. Many people are not familiar. This man here is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan was he was summoned by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president at the time, to put together this seminal study on Black folks called the Negro Family. Now, many people have cleaned up this language, and this is now called the Moynihan Report. But the original title is the Negro Family. And as you can see from the cover here, the case for national action. One thing that has happened in American history, especially since slavery ended, was what do we do? This is from a white perspective. What do we do with the Negroes? Right? The Negroes have continued and always been a question. What do we do with this segment of population that we need, but we don't necessarily like? And the Negro Family touches on this situation. So, originally published in 1965, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action was written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was an American psychologist, and it was Assistant Secretary of Labor under Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, what Daniel Patrick Moynihan did was he went all around the country, went to various different Black communities, talked to Black leaders in those communities, whether those are civil rights leaders or pastors or people who had pull in the community. He talked to other academics who were Blacks at that time. Wasn't a lot of us. But there were folks that he talked to put together this report. And some of the findings from this report were things that have didn't rub Black people the right way. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan actually got into a little bit of trouble and has definitely been seen as a racist due to some of his findings and things that he talked about. So some of the key findings that I'm going to talk about here, or just kind of highlight here for you, were that Black people have never been accepted into the American dream. We were never a part of the American dream per se. We were a tool for other people to have the American dream. And that's one of the things that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said. If we want to help these Black folks, we need to help them, one, formulate a concept for this American dream, and and then also understand that they are Americans, right? So this is revolutionary talk from a white man during this time. The other thing that he pointed out was the matriarchal system does not work within the American Western system. So this matriarchal system that we somewhat brought over from Africa and was kind of morphed and manifested during slavery into this whole big mama, strong Black woman kind of archetype, does not fit into this Western system where it's more patriarchal. There's a clash there, and it creates a problem. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan talked about this problem that it creates, which got sisters pissed off, and they weren't happy with him at all when he was talking about this, because what it sounded like from the perspective of Black women was blaming the victim, like it's all their fault. But I think the way that I interpret the Moynihan report is him just laying out things that he's seen, not necessarily saying it was anyone's fault. But at that time, he faced a lot of scrutiny. He put his foot in his mouth several times, so it is what it is. The other things that he pointed out was Black men must be employed, must have employment. He said, in order for the Black community to rise to this level, where they're in a better social condition in the United States, we have to make sure that Black men are employed. And this was kind of the catalyst for things like affirmative action, which ultimately did not help Black men. It helped white women. But that's a whole nother course in itself to dive into. But this is what Moynihan pushed forth. And the last key finding that I'm going to point out that Moynihan put together was repairing the Black family is key. Moynihan foresaw this. If Black families are not in position to be healthy, they cannot build healthy communities. And if they don't have healthy communities, they're going to have more issues than they currently do. And Moynihan put in some predictions in his report, and one of his predictions is that if the Black family doesn't get fixed, in the next 20 to 30 years, they're going to be in even worse shape than they are today, which I believe is true. Have things gotten better in some instances? Absolutely. But when we take a scale back and we look at the Black family as a whole, we have a big gap and a big need to really improve our family structures, to improve our community. And a lot of this comes from Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report that he foreseen these things. But remember, he got a lot of this information from Black people who were doing the work in the community. He formulated it and put it into a process for the government to understand what's happening so that they can make better choices and policies, and they can make better decisions in helping Black folks, even though things have not got 100% better. This is one of the steps for us to understand what we got to, how we got to where we are. Highly recommend that people check this out. And I'm giving out a lot of resources in today's course. But if you don't pay attention to any of the other resources, you definitely want to check out the Moynihan report. You can find it free on Google, or you can just email me and I can email you a PDF copy of it. No problem. We're going to talk about the fifth trauma point next, the war on drugs era that we call the hyper ghetto era. So, this era is a tough one because this is the era that I was born into, the hyper ghetto and prison era. Started in 1975 into 1990. And the hyper ghetto era was this extreme concentrations of poverty and underprivileged groups all put into one area. Some communities had projects, right? Some communities had actual projects where you had these tall stacked buildings with people just stacked on top of each other. We started to see an influx of drugs in the community. We started to see another point where Black men were taken out of the community with the prison industrial complex. Men starting to get jailed for selling drugs. The first drug epidemic that hit our communities was heroin, that hit in the 70s, but it didn't have that huge impact like crack cocaine did in the early 80s and into the 90s. And one of the things that we don't talk about enough is how crack really impacted the community. We know it was bad, but we don't talk about what I have discovered as the two main reasons why it was very bad. The first main reason is that crack cocaine was the first drug to have had a major impact on women. People don't look at it like this, but think about it. If we have a matriarchal system where women have a lot of authority, pull, and stature in the community, and then you bring a drug that impacts women very hard, like crack cocaine, where Black women are, neglecting their children, going and prostituting themselves, putting themselves in very dangerous situations, stealing all types of things just because they are addicted to a drug, just to get another high. That tears away at the fabric of a community like no other. And crack cocaine did this, unfortunately, to a lot of Black women. Now, every Black woman was not on crack. For some reason, when I do trainings and I talk about this, people think that every Black woman was on crack cocaine, which blows my mind, but that's not true. But enough Black women were that it caused a ripple effect in the community that we have not been able to bounce back from since. So that's one reason why this era was critical and why crack cocaine was a pivotal drug for the Black community. The second reason that also doesn't get talked about is that crack was an economic system. Black folks lived off the crack trade. I don't know another way to say it. On one end, the community is being poisoned. On the other end, some of the community is benefiting from this. This was highlighted in New Jack City, where you have on one end, you have the community being poisoned by the drug, and on the other end, people are getting fed. And there were dope dealers who were taking care of their whole block, their whole family, by selling drugs. And this is how families start getting into the whole drug trade together, where you get a couple different generations doing it. It ain't just one person, it's several people. This is also how you get young people involved in the drug trade, because you also have to remember in the 80s is when they start to scale back on social programs. So those social programs like after school programs, so those things start to slowly disappear in the 80s and more in the 90s. And when you have a lot of kids have idle time, nothing to do, and you have opportunities like selling drugs for them to make money, especially if they don't have money and their families don't have money already, that becomes very enticing. So you can bribe a young, 13-year-old Black kid, hey man, you want to make a quick $20? Take this backpack and go drop it off at Johnny. He's down on, 3rd and 17th, and you give him that backpack, and when you come back, I'm gonna give you this $20, man, no sweat. Think about being a young 13-year-old. You can make a quick $20 in the 80s. just to drop off a backpack, absolutely you're going to jump on that opportunity. And the reason why this happened is brothers got smart, right? They were sick of going to jail. They knew that the police forces were coming at them. We had presidents talking about they're going to have a war on drugs. But one of the things that we did not have at this time was a juvenile justice system like we do today. At that time, if a young kid got picked up for selling drugs or picked up for anything, they would usually let that kid out within a 72-hour period. So you can get in, get out real quick, but they was locking brothers up, giving them, what we call football numbers in the hood. All right. So we have this increased police presence that starts to get formulated during this time in policing the community. This is an era that I think they're all detrimental, but I think this has been one of the most detrimental eras outside of actual slavery for Black folks, because this is where we really start to see, again, the fabric of our community. Everything that we hold near and dear to ourselves as Black folks in the United States really took a big hit during this time. And I don't think we really understand the impact that it has taken, which leads me to the sixth trauma point that is going to lead us to the next day session that we're going to all have together. This concept that I call the institutionalized generation. The institutionalized generation is what we're currently in the phase of right now. In essence, the institutionalized generation started in the mid-'80s, 1980s, to where we are now, where we have institutions that have this extreme authority in our lives, where we have people who are chronically dependent on institutions for our basic needs and basic survival. And this is dangerous because the institutions have replaced the community. I'm gonna say that one more time. The institutions in our lives have replaced the community. The things that we used to have, the responsibility to one another, the sense of community, the respect and the admiration of community that we once have been replaced by nonprofit agencies, government agencies, and actual companies to take care of our basic needs for survival. I believe that this is one of the dangers in what we see today, because we are about 3 generations into this situation where Black folks are chronically dependent on institutions for our basic needs and basic survival. We're talking about housing, talking about food, education, right? Basic needs, our safety needs. We have lost that ability as a community to survive amongst one another without these institutions that we don't control influx into our community. And I'm gonna go deeper into this on the next session that we have together for our 5th day, because this is very vital to understand where we are today in this institutionalized generation, in this intergenerational trauma. We are at a point where we are chronically dependent on institutions for our daily survival. And I'm not just talking about, who pays your light bill and the energy company and the water company. Yeah, everybody deals with that. But I'm talking about just those basic needs that we used to get from the community that we now get from institutions. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining me today for day 4. Day 5, we're going to get into the institutionalized generation. If you have any questions, you can find me at jegna.org. Once again, jegna.org. And I'm at universaljones on all social media platforms. Thank you again for being with me today, and I'll holla at you next time. Peace.